What if the first modern war wasn't fought for victory, but for illusion? A war no one needed, triggered by a dead monk, a forgotten monastery, and the ghosts of empires clawing for relevance. Men froze in trenches while kings played chess with blood. A battlefield wired to newspapers, where truth bled out faster than soldiers. France needed glory. Britain feared shadows. Russia wanted God. The Ottomans just wanted to exist. Lines were drawn. Cannons roared. Nothing would be the same. This wasn't just Crimea. It was the fuse. The test run. The beginning of now. You were never meant to see this. But it's too late. 1853. A winter wind howled through the corridors of Istanbul, rattling shutters like distant gunfire. Somewhere in the gloom, the Ottoman Sultan Abdülmecid sat motionless beneath the weight of velvet drapes and ancient banners, reading a letter he already knew would ruin him. Outside his palace walls, the empire wheezed, old, bloated, and slipping further from the world that once feared it. In the Danubian principalities, Russian boots were already sinking into the frozen earth. There was no thunder of war yet, only silence, the kind that hums behind your ears right before something breaks. That terrifying stillness when empires, stretched thin, begin to tear without screaming. The Ottomans called themselves guardians of the faith, but their grip on the Holy Lands had rotted into a mockery. In Jerusalem, priests brawled inside the Church of the Nativity, Orthodox against Catholic, fists flying over keys and candles. Blood smeared across marble as monks fought like street thugs, all while empires waited, watching, calculating. This wasn't about religion. Not really. It was about control masked as faith, domination hidden in sanctity. And Russia moved first. Tsar Nicholas I, cold, brooding, obsessed with divine mission, declared himself protector of all Orthodox Christians in Ottoman lands. He claimed it was duty. But duty doesn't march 100,000 men into Moldavia and Wallachia. Duty doesn't sharpen bayonets by the Black Sea or rattle sabers outside Constantinople. No, this was ambition fed by theology. And ambition, dressed as righteousness, is always hungry for war. The British heard it first in dispatches from Vienna, Russian troops advancing, Ottoman resistance crumbling, and then orders to the fleet. The HMS Britannia raised anchor, its iron belly groaning as it turned toward the Dardanelles. Across the channel, the French echoed the call. Napoleon III didn't want peace. He wanted revenge, on history, on ridicule, on the ghosts of Waterloo. Crimea was a stage, and he would not be absent. But this war wasn't born of strategy. It bled out of paranoia. Britain feared its empire would choke without access to India. France feared slipping into irrelevance if Russia swallowed Constantinople. And Russia? It feared the Ottoman corpse would be picked clean before it could take a bite. In smoky war rooms from London to St. Petersburg, maps were inked with red lines and impossible dreams. But none could answer the question burning like acid through Europe's chancelleries. What happens when the Ottoman Empire dies? The Eastern question, they called it. A phrase so sterile, so clean, it barely hinted at the chaos beneath. But it was no question. It was a prophecy waiting to be fulfilled. The Ottoman Empire had ruled for centuries. Now it was mocked as the sick man of Europe. Not dying, not yet, but coughing blood into silk handkerchiefs, held up for all to see. June 1853. Russian troops crossed the Pruth River. Ottoman soil. No declaration, no warning. Just the crunch of boots, the drag of artillery, and the quiet terror of towns staring into the black eyes of occupation. In Constantinople, they burned letters, not candles. Ministers scrambled to stall the inevitable. But no treaty could stop what was already in motion. The bear had stepped into the yard, and the lions of Europe weren't ready. Then came the ultimatum. Nicholas I, arrogant and certain, demanded a formal protectorate over all Orthodox subjects in the empire. A demand the Ottomans could never grant. Not without handing over their spine. Not without erasing their sovereignty. Refusal was suicide, but acceptance was worse. Sultan Abdülmecid blinked and said no. That single word detonated across the continent. Within weeks, war drums echoed from the Bosphorus to the Thames. But Britain and France did not leap into war to save the Ottomans. They marched to stop Russia, not for peace, but for balance. The fragile, teetering balance of a Europe held together by distrust and fear. If Constantinople fell, the scales would tip. Russia would own the Black Sea, threaten the Mediterranean, shake Egypt, Persia, even India. And the rest? They'd kneel or burn. So fleets moved. Soldiers kissed families goodbye in the rain. Somewhere in Marseille, a mother clutched a medal already engraved for a son not yet dead. And all the while, Constantinople waited, caught between protectors who didn't care and invaders who would never leave. This wasn't a holy war. It was a funeral procession in reverse. The corpse still breathed, but the grave was dug, and the mourners were armed. The Danubian principalities, Moldavia and Wallachia, became the fuse. Russian banners flew where Ottoman law once ruled. Skirmishes flared. Tensions boiled. Diplomacy frayed like old rope stretched to breaking. By October 1853, it snapped. The Ottoman Empire, trembling, cornered, declared war. The world shifted. What began in a chapel brawl over a key had set fire to a continent. The priests in Jerusalem had no idea they'd opened the gates to something so large, so savage, so cold. Gunboats moved through the Bosphorus. The Black Sea darkened with the shadows of empire. And every man on every side felt it in his gut. This wasn't just about Crimea. This was the beginning of something terrible, something modern, something that would echo for centuries. A scream tore through the morning fog, short, ragged, then gone. The kind of sound that doesn't echo because it knows no one is coming. September 1854. The beaches of Eupatoria bled silence before they bled men. British boots hit the sand first, heavy and clumsy, sinking into foreign earth like it didn't want them. French troops followed, more confident, more colorful, but no less doomed. The Ottoman allies landed last, uncertain, already forgotten. They thought they were invading a province. What they were walking into was a trap designed by no one and sprung by everyone. They marched south toward Sevastopol under a sun that seemed to sneer. Horses dropped dead mid-step. Wagons snapped their axles. Carts meant for shells carried the sick instead. Generals barked orders with maps that didn't show rivers. The men couldn't tell if the stench came from the marshes or from fear. Then the River Alma, September 20th, Green Hills. Russian guns perched above, waiting. They climbed anyway. Through rifle fire, through screams, through mud that pulled at ankles like a grave refusing to stay shut. The Highlanders charged uphill like ghosts in kilts, sabers flashing under the smoke. French troops stormed cliffs no one sane would have attempted. Russians broke, but not for long. They retreated to Sevastopol. The real war was just starting. Balaclava, October 25th. The dawn hung in the sky like a blade not yet dropped. The orders came folded. Words twisted in translation, poisoned by pride. Lord Raglan wanted one thing. Lord Lucan read another. Lord Cardigan rode anyway. The charge of the Light Brigade was no mistake. It was a death sentence written in elegant ink. 600 men on horseback, lances raised, eyes fixed forward. The Russians had guns. Rows of them. Batteries on the sides. Cannons dead ahead. The whole valley lit with steel. It should have been suicide. It was. They rode into it. Not for victory. Not for glory. For duty, because they were told to, because they thought they had to. Horses screamed louder than men. The earth buckled under hooves and blood. Smoke swallowed the horizon. When it cleared, the British command stared in stunned silence. Half the brigade didn't ride back. Tennyson would write poetry. The survivors coughed blood into the dirt. 10 days later, Inkerman. Fog thick enough to choke. Rain fell sideways. The kind of battle where you can't see your enemy until your bayonet finds his throat. British and French forces barely held the line. Russian soldiers charged in waves, ghosts in the mist, their boots slipping on corpses from the night before. Commanders fought blind. Muskets misfired in the wet. No tactics, just survival. By the end of it, no one could say who'd won, only who hadn't died. And then came the siege. Sevastopol, November. The mud turned black. The wind bit through bone. Snow arrived before food did. The trenches filled with water. Then with rats. Then with men who wouldn't wake up. Cannons boomed from dawn till nothing mattered. Artillery duels that shook the ground and meant nothing. Russian engineers tunneled like moles. British gunners fired blind. The French dug with spoons when the shovels froze. Thousands lived in holes. Slept with lice. Ate mold. Froze beside the same men they'd fought with the day before. Supplies? Lost at sea. misdirected, rotting in crates. The British Army had wool coats back in London. Here they had frostbite. Here they had amputations done without morphine. Here they had no plan. The hospitals stank worse than the battlefield. And that's where she walked in. Florence Nightingale. A lamp, a ledger, and a stare that broke men in half. She cleaned what others abandoned. She boiled linens until the walls wept. She counted the dying, named the dead, refused to let disease finish what bullets started. She didn't come to save them. She came to stop the bleeding. And she did, slowly, mercilessly, beautifully. Back in Britain, the newspapers told everything, or almost everything. The first war to be reported in real time. Telegraphs tapped out names before coffins arrived. Reporters stood shoulder to shoulder with corpses, scribbling death into print. The people at home read headlines soaked in blood and tea. Public outrage exploded. Parliament panicked. Generals became scapegoats. But the war didn't care. It dragged on, indifferent, feeding on mistakes, thriving on ego. British officers fought with French commanders more than with Russians. Orders arrived days late. Maps were wrong. Weather reports were myths. In December, whole camps were buried under snow. Tents collapsed. Rifles froze. Men burned letters from home just to feel heat. There were no heroes in Sevastopol, just survivors. And even they weren't sure they deserved the name. The ink was still wet on the letter when the walls began to shake. Paris, 1854. In the grand halls of the Tuileries Palace, beneath chandeliers that dripped with old bourbon gilt, Napoleon III stood in front of a mirror, not adjusting his medals, but studying the weight of his reflection. Outside, the bells rang. Not for prayer, for war. The emperor blinked, not from fear, but from need. This war was not a burden. It was a ladder, and he would climb it with other people's sons. France had not forgotten Waterloo. Napoleon III never had the chance to. Every street, every whisper, every glance. He felt it in his spine, the sneer of history. Crimea was his answer. Glory would silence doubt. Blood would clean the family name. Across the channel, Britain didn't blink, it calculated. Foreign Office memos came wrapped in silence and ink-black coffee. Lord Aberdeen's cabinet split down the middle. Hawks clawing for war, doves begging for time. But the press had already chosen. The Times spat headlines like bullets. Public opinion was boiling. The Queen wanted honor. The generals wanted maps. The army wanted socks. No one had them. Britain wasn't chasing glory. It was chasing equilibrium. If Russia broke the Ottoman spine, the empire's eastward arteries would choke. Constantinople was more than a city. It was a shadow that stretched to India. But even as fleets sailed and battalions drilled, the doubt lingered. This wasn't a war of defense. It was a war of prevention, fought not because someone invaded London or Paris, but because someone might. Austria watched and twisted the knife. They stood on the edge, one foot in alliance, one in betrayal. They had once marched with Russia against revolution, bonded by the memory of fire and monarchy. But in 1854, they smiled as Russia stumbled and whispered neutrality. Not out of cowardice, out of calculation. Austria issued ultimatums to the Tsar while sipping from the same goblet of empire. They moved troops to the Danube, not to fight, but to loom, to show their weight, to remind the world that Vienna still mattered. It didn't stop the bleeding, but it proved one thing. The Holy Alliance was dead. Crown no longer recognized crown. Survival now spoke louder than loyalty. In Berlin, the silence was different. Colder. Prussia folded its arms and stayed home. Not because it was weak, but because it was waiting. Every Prussian general knew the map would change. Every diplomat knew Crimea was only the first crack. Let the others bleed. Let France puff up. Let Austria pick sides like a coward. Prussia would remain untouched until it chose not to be. It was 1854, but somewhere in the smoke, Bismarck was already smirking. Russia felt the knives too late. Nicholas I stood in the snow outside St. Petersburg, watching a column of shivering conscripts march into a war he thought he controlled. He prayed as the reports rolled in. Alma, Balaclava, Sevastopol. Prayers didn't fix frostbite, didn't melt blocked ports, didn't replace horses that starved on frozen roads. He thought he was protecting the church. He thought God was with him. But faith cracked under the weight of strategy. The orthodox protector became the isolated aggressor. France and Britain circled like wolves. Austria tightened the leash. Prussia watched the fire spread. And the Tsar? He died before the siege ended. Some said it was pneumonia. Others said heartbreak. His empire didn't care which. And the Ottomans, those poor, proud bones, stood shaking at the center of it all. Guns behind them. Enemies ahead. Allies who never stopped looking down. They didn't start this war, but they would pay for it in ways none of the others could. Their empire was defended, but not respected. Protected, but not trusted. Help came wrapped in debt and disdain. Every shell fired for them came with a price. Every victory chipped away at their authority. The West promised survival, but never sovereignty. In Crimea, the Ottoman flag flew next to British and French banners. But no one saluted it. Not really. The war was never about them. It was about their corpse, still breathing. Every empire asked the same question in secret. When do we carve? And so they played the game. Paris schemed for prestige. London fought for balance. Vienna slithered through diplomacy. Berlin watched in silence. St. Petersburg bled alone. And Constantinople? It smiled with broken teeth, too proud to beg, too weak to refuse. The alliances were real, but the trust was not. And the guns never cared who the bullets were meant for. A single cannon fired. Not in anger, not in warning. Just once, then silence. September 9th, 1855. The Russian flag over Sevastopol fell like a shot bird, limp and red-streaked from fire. Smoke rose in coils over the craters where houses used to be. What was left of the defenders didn't speak. They couldn't. Their mouths were caked with blood and ash. Some wept. Others just stared at nothing. Sevastopol had held for 11 months. Now it was bones and rubble. The last stronghold shattered. The jewel of the Black Sea gone. And with it, the illusion that this war had purpose. Somewhere in the fog, French soldiers cheered. British troops lit cigars with shaking hands. Ottoman banners fluttered beside foreign ones. But the city had no use for victors. It had buried too many of them. Nicholas I wasn't there to see it. He had died 6 months earlier, March 1855, alone in the Winter Palace, coughing behind velvet curtains. Some said it was pneumonia. Some said suicide. All agreed he died broken. His empire humiliated. His soldiers freezing in trenches he'd ordered them into. His dreams of orthodox greatness dissolved into swamp water and gunpowder. His son, Alexander II, took the throne with eyes wide open. He didn't want peace. He needed it. Because what stood behind the war wasn't glory, it was famine, revolt, bankruptcy, soldiers deserting, nobles whispering. The Tsar knew if Crimea continued, the empire might not. But peace came slow and bitter. In Paris, diplomats wore white gloves and silver smiles. In Vienna, Austrians acted as if they'd fought. In London, Parliament squabbled over whose incompetence had been most fatal. And in Constantinople, Ottoman officials shook hands while wondering how long the handshake would last. The Treaty of Paris was signed on March 30th, 1856. A single page of paper, dozens of lives per word. Russia would give back land. The Danube would reopen. The Black Sea? Neutral. No warships. No fortresses. Just water and silence. The Tsar had to agree, teeth grinding behind a forced nod. The humiliation was sharp enough to taste. Ottoman territorial integrity was guaranteed. A phrase that sounded strong but meant nothing. The empire was now a puppet with a throne. Its veins pumped Western promises, not strength. And every power that signed the treaty was already counting the days until it collapsed again. There were no celebrations. Even in Paris, where Napoleon III tried to paint it as triumph, the applause rang hollow. France had bled for prestige. And prestige, like smoke, slips through fingers. In London, veterans limped through crowds that didn't meet their eyes. The newspapers printed victory. The streets printed silence. Sevastopol was gone. But the war had only changed shape. Austria had gained nothing and lost everything. Russia would never forget their betrayal. The Holy Alliance was finished. Moscow would never march for Vienna again. And Austria, cornered and aging, would one day learn what it meant to be truly alone. Prussia watched all of it from behind its cold walls. Not a single shot fired, yet every general took notes. The alliances, the mistakes, the timing. They saw what blood bought and what arrogance cost. Nationalism, quiet and coiled, stirred beneath every capital. In Italy, revolutionaries whispered about how France might be useful. In Germany, thinkers asked why Prussia hadn't led instead of waited. In Russia, Reform was no longer a choice. Alexander II signed the peace, but his mind was on his people, on the serfs chained to frozen land, on the army rotting from the inside, on the need to rebuild, not walls, but the soul of the empire. And to rebuild, he would have to tear something old down. Every empire that walked away from Paris walked with a limp. No one trusted the treaty. No one believed it would last. Because the question still burned: what happens when the Ottoman Empire finally dies? The paper said it would live. The gun said otherwise. There was no real peace in 1856. Only a pause, a breath held, a wound stitched shut without cleaning. The next war was already watching. A shovel hit something solid. Steel scrapes bone. Beneath the scorched fields outside Sevastopol, in 1856, they were still digging. Graves, trenches, latrines, it didn't matter anymore. The war was over. But the ground hadn't forgotten. The soil was thick with blood and metal. When it rained, it smelled like rust and death. The men who walked away from Crimea didn't leave it behind. They carried it in shattered limbs and frostbitten feet, in the bullet lodged near the spine, in the sound of a cannon that never really stopped echoing. And yet, something else rose from that silence. Something colder, more lasting. A new kind of war had been born. In London, men scribbled numbers. Freight tonnage, ammunition rates, supply chains. They talked about Crimea like it was a warehouse gone wrong. Because that's what it had been, a disaster of movement, of planning, of care. Thousands had died waiting for coats, for boots, for bread that sat spoiled on British docks. So they changed. The War Office became more than a room. It became a machine. Faster, colder, more precise. Hospitals were reformed. Maps redrawn. Officers promoted for skill instead of title, at least sometimes. Crimea had exposed everything wrong with Britain's military pride, and from the rot came something sharp. But pride is stubborn. The British Empire came out of Crimea not humbled, but hungry. It had fought on foreign soil and survived. That was enough. The humiliation of the Light Brigade was softened into legend. The blunders rewoven into myths of courage. By 1857, London spoke of Crimea with teeth clenched and chests puffed. It would take another century for the lies to rot through the skin. In Paris, they printed victory in gold leaf. Napoleon III stood in front of mirrors again, older now, but gleaming. He had done what his uncle couldn't, defeated Russia. The Second Empire swelled with confidence, parading its wounded through the boulevards. Crimea became proof. France was back, but victories won on borrowed time don't last. 15 years later, in 1870, French soldiers would march into battle against Prussia under banners that still smelled of Sevastopol, and they would be crushed. The ghosts of Crimea offered no help as Napoleon III was dragged down into exile, and his empire, built on smoke, collapsed into ash. In Russia, the pain had gone inward. Crimea wasn't just a loss. It was a wound cut straight through the soul of the Tsarist state. When Alexander II signed the Treaty of Paris, he wasn't surrendering. He was pausing. Because he saw what his father hadn't, that Russia was broken from the inside out. The serfs who had died for Sevastopol still lived in chains. That would end. In 1861, 5 years after the war, the chains were legally cut. Not out of compassion, out of necessity. A modern empire couldn't march on medieval legs. The army was rebuilt. New rifles, new railways, new officers trained to think, not just obey. Russia wouldn't make the same mistake twice. But it never forgot the humiliation. Crimea became sacred, loss turned into legend, defeat reshaped into martyrdom. Russian textbooks didn't speak of failure. They spoke of sacrifice, the kind that demands repayment. And over a century later, in 2014, Russian troops crossed into Crimea again, not to conquer, to reclaim. The flag they raised over Simferopol didn't flap in the wind. It hung heavy, soaked in history, in the blood of ancestors buried under Sevastopol's broken stones. Moscow spoke of justice, of return, of memory. But the world heard something older, the echo of 1855 still bouncing through time. In Constantinople, soon to be Istanbul, the Ottomans limped into reform. The Tanzimat decrees promised justice, equality, new laws, new courts. They spoke of modernization, of survival. But the promises were soaked in Western ink. France and Britain had saved the empire, and now they wanted it shaped in their image. The Sultan issued orders. Ministers rewrote taxes. Schools were opened. Christians and Muslims were declared equal under law. But nothing moved fast enough. And behind every reform was a shadow, dependency. The empire had won the war, but it had lost the right to breathe without permission. Every loan came with strings. Every treaty, a collar. Crimea had taught the Ottomans that survival was possible, but never free. And in the quiet corners of Europe, something darker stirred. Nationalism. Italy saw how empires stumbled and smelled opportunity. Men like Cavour and Garibaldi would soon make their move. In Germany, the memory of Crimean blunders became strategy. Bismarck understood the value of neutrality, of watching while others burned. The balance of power was shifting, slowly, bloodlessly, but not for long, because the next spark wouldn't come from a monastery in Jerusalem. It would come from Sarajevo, and when it did, the guns that fired in 1914 would still carry the smoke of Sevastopol in their barrels. The alliances, the misjudgments, the fear of collapse disguised as diplomacy, it was all there already, etched into the bones of Crimea. The war had ended, but its shadow never left. It crouched behind every border. It watched every empire age and break. It waited, still waiting,